Welcome back, everybody. Today I'm making the second part in the Mastering Retopology series called How to Retopologize. In this video, I'm going to be giving you tips and tricks and a lot of information that I had to research a lot and spend a lot of time looking up. And I just wanted to condense all of that information into one readily available video so that you can use the info in it and hopefully it will help you in your future projects. Now, when you think about retopology, first thing that might come to your mind would be something that looks like this. But the problem with this is, as you might have noticed or guessed, this kind of retopology is horrible for deformation and things like that. It's perfectly fine to be placed in a game engine, and the game engine is not going to have a lot of difficulty rendering it, and the same goes for texturing. But weight painting, rigging, animation, it's going to be awful. The deformation in it is going to completely suck. So one of the main rules when you're retopologizing something that is actually going to deform, something that's going to move, is edge flow. And edge flow essentially is something similar to what you see here. It's where you make loops around things that are going to deform. So as you can see here, around the knees and elbows, and also around the face, the mouth, the nose, the eyes, all of these things are things that will move and they will have a lot of deformation when they're being rigged and animated. And as such, if you just make it squares stacked on top of each other, the deformation is going to look really bad. But doing it in this method will make the deformation much more fluid and a lot more smooth. The other key is with utilizing edge loops is it's really helpful when you're trying to deviate from the normal pathing of the edges. And what I mean by that is, if you're making a torso or a leg, usually you're making it in a circular shape as it rises up. And when you come across something else that's going to go elsewhere, like for example with the leg, as you're rising up from the thigh into the torso, it's not the same circular shape. And so it's a lot better to make defined edge loops before you even start on the retopology process, because it helps a lot with attaching edges and keeping your retopology concise and in place. A big mistake that I did earlier on in my career is not putting defined edge loops where it mattered, and that caused my mesh to have really bad edge loops. And the worst thing that you can ever have in a retopologized mesh is spirals. And spirals is when instead of having closed edge loops, it continuously goes up like a spiral case. And that is awful, because not only does it not do well with texturing and stuff like that, it makes retopologizing a living hell for you. Because whenever you need to actually add a single edge loop, you're going to end up adding tens or even hundreds of vertices, which is just really bad. And this is one of the earlier meshes I did, and as you can see, it doesn't have a lot of good edge loops, but at the same time it also has some of the decent principles. In this particular mesh, my biggest problem was the limbs. The feet and the hands were done really badly. And if I would go back and retopologize it again from scratch, I'd probably do a much better job, because this mesh was done well over a year ago and I've improved a lot since then. As you can see, I try to maintain the basic rules of retopology, which is, maintaining proper edge loops and maintaining good edge flow as well as not causing spirals. And that ended up helping my mesh tremendously, so much so that I was able to rig it. And as you can see here in these animations, the mesh deforms quite decently. Now, when I am showing you these three squares and I'm asking you here, do you think there is a difference between them? And at first glance, it probably doesn't look that different. But once I use this X-ray or grid view, you're going to see that there are three differences between them. The first one is done completely using quads. The second one has an n-gon in it, and an n-gon is what you call any face that has more than 4 vertices. It's called an n-gon. And the third one is a triangle. Now, 3D software, all 3D software is designed to work with quads. Over here, as you can see with the quads piece, when you press Ctrl R to add edge loops into it, it goes into it seamlessly and it doesn't have any problem dealing with it. And you can bend it, you can bevel it, you can add a subsurface modifier, and it works completely fine because that's what the software was made to do. Even though at its core all 3D engines transform quads back into triangles. So every render of any game or cutscene that you look at, the final render of these media uses triangles. What you're looking at is very, very, very small looking triangles. So you might ask me, why don't we work with triangles when we're working in 3D software like Maya or Blender? And the answer for that is working with triangles is infinitely more complicated and hard than working with quads. And so 3D developers designed the software to work with quads, and then inside of it, once you start rendering, it transforms it into triangles itself. And that's the reason why n-gons are really, really bad. It's because 3D software just cannot comprehend how to properly transform n-gons into triangles, which is why you end up getting artifacting. And it's also why having triangles in your mesh isn't good, even though it doesn't really affect performance later on. It can cause problems with artifacting the same way that n-gons do, because the engine itself, again, it is expecting to receive quads. If you give it triangles when it's trying to deal with quads, it's not going to handle it well. But when you go over to the n-gon, you can see that the edge loops work perfectly fine around it with the quads. But the instant that you try to add a edge loop through the n-gon, the engine doesn't know what to do with it, because again, it wasn't made to deal with n-gons, it was made to deal with quads. So when you try to introduce this foreign thing to it, it doesn't know how to deal with it, and so edge loops just do not work with it. It might look fine to you right now, and even after I add the subsurface modifier, it doesn't look that bad to you, and you might think that it's fine. But if I take you to this model over here, and I take you to this part, and I end up starting to create n-gons, like this 6-sided n-gon, you can instantly start to see artifacting in it in comparison to the other thing. And you also have to keep in mind that even if the mesh doesn't look bad in the 3D viewer, with the n-gons, texturing over n-gons is nigh impossible. So even if you manage to hide n-gons in terms of the vertices and the faces, you will never be able to properly texture n-gons it will be an absolute nightmare, or rig n-gons, physics based rendering, everything or dealing with n-gons will have the software breaking down completely. Now I want to bring this to your attention. N-gons, they are really bad, but at the same time, having one or two n-gons in the mesh will not be the end of the world. You can have a couple of n-gons if you're able to hide it well. For example, one of the most famous spots to have an n-gon is down below at the crotch area. And the reason for that is twofold. First of all, it can help you tremendously in saving precious polygons, which is going to help your performance. Another thing is that you don't care about texturing down in that area. So whenever you have a place in a mesh that isn't going to be seen and isn't going to be interacted with, you can take shortcuts by creating n-gons and saving yourself performance through having less vertices, as well as not dealing with the problems like deformation and texturing, since it's not even going to be seen. So the armpits and the crotch area can very easily have n-gons in it, but again, you should not go ham on the n-gons, because after a certain point it starts badly affecting your performance, because again, engines just cannot handle n-gons properly. Now when we go to the triangle section of the square, you might be inclined to create triangles in your meshes, and I will say that triangles are better than n-gons. They are worse than quads, but they are better than n-gons. So if you are forced to make an n-gon, you're better off making a triangle if you can. But it's still not preferred to have it, because as you can see here, when I take you over to this, back to this character that I created, and I make triangles in it, you can see that the deformation still happens in it, and the artifacting is still being produced. And again, this is a sign of the engine just not being able to handle it properly. So now that we've gotten that out of the way, and I have explained why quads are incredibly important to you, the other thing that I want to stress is tips about edge flow. And what I mean by that is, over here, as you can see, we have what we call, or what I call, reducing topology naturally. Because one of the main things that I didn't know how to do early on in my career when I was learning retopology was, I knew that some parts of the mesh needed to be dense with polygons, and some areas needed to be light on the polygon count. For example, the head is usually the most dense area with polygons, but the limbs are the least dense area with polygons. So the arms and the legs are supposed to have the least amount of polygons, while the face will have the most amount of vertices in it. Learning about these kinds of modifications that you can do to your mesh to help reduce the count at a certain part was unbelievably helpful, because as you can see here, now I don't particularly use all of these, and there are even more than these. Mainly what I use is the 3-to-1, it's like the most helpful for me, and the 4-to-2. And sometimes I use the 2-to-1. Now, if you have a keen eye, you might have noticed that the 3-to-1, the 4-to-2, and the 5-to-3 are essentially the same thing. You see, the 3-to-1 takes the leftmost and loops it into the third one, and then the center one is the part that continues downward. The 4-to-1 is exactly the same one, except it has an edge loop going down the center of it. And then the 5-to-3 is the exact same as the 3-to-1, but it has two extra edge loops going to the side of it. And the 3 to 1 is the most used one that I use more than anything. I sometimes end up using the 2 to 1, but it doesn't get used often because sometimes having an edge loop going to the exact side 90 degrees is not very helpful and can sometimes cause problems with your edge flow. But in certain situations it can be very helpful, and I do recommend properly memorizing these two exactly. I mainly only use these two, I don't use anything else. And this is pretty much it. I don't think I've left anything out. If I forgot something and I remember it later, I'm going to put it down in the comment section. But these tips and this information alone helped me elevate my retopology tenfold, and I hope it was helpful for you. If you want to know anything more, or if you have any other question, put it down in the comment section. If you found this video helpful, I hope you like and subscribe. I want to reach 1,000 subs soon. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.